This is Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and we are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Skrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Welcome back, Steve.
Thank you very much. Very good to be back. And, of course, our intrepid producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve. Welcome back.
And, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, and welcome, listeners, to a show like none other from one of the greatest journalists and truth tellers in Israel itself.
You are correct, Ralph. Our guest today, Gideon Levy, is making his second appearance on the program. We first spoke to him on October 11th, 2023, 4 days after October 7th, but only for 6 minutes before he had to retreat to a bomb shelter. Gideon Levy is an Israeli journalist who writes the weekly Twilight Zone column for the newspaper Haaretz. In the Twilight Zone, he's been covering the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza for decades. He's compiled those columns in a new book, The Killing of Gaza, Reports on a Catastrophe. One reviewer says, quote, Levy is a rare voice of dissent, a humane and courageous Israeli journalist who weekly documents the moral degradation of colonization on the Jewish state and its disastrous impact on the Palestinian people, end quote. We'll speak to him about anti-Semitism, the starry state of the peace movement in Israel, and how he personally is holding up as a lone voice of dissent in a sea of citizens hungry for vengeance. As always, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhyber, but first, let's get a first-hand report on a catastrophe. David?
Gideon Levy is a Haaretz columnist and a member of the newspaper's editorial board. He is the author of the weekly Twilight Zone feature, which covers the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza over the last 25 years, as well as the writer of political editorials for the newspaper. He is the author of The Punishment of Gaza, and his latest book is The Killing of Gaza, Reports on a Catastrophe. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Gideon Levy.
Thank you, David, so much for having me.
Welcome back indeed. Our many thousands of listeners should know that Gideon Levy is a columnist for the free thinking and free reporting newspaper Haaretz, but he's also a reporter, and he's reported from hotspots around the world as well as from Gaza until the Israeli government blocked all entry for independent reporting into Gaza years ago by not only Israeli reporters, but U.S. reporters and reporters from all over the world. With that background and your many trips to Gaza and your knowledge of Palestinian life, I want to start with a projective question, which is, how do you envision the settlement on a sustainable basis of this conflict between Israel and Palestine going forward?
So first of all, thank you, Ralph, for having me. It's always a great honor for me to talk to you. That's a big question you raised, but it has an answer. Look, for many years, all of us, I guess also you, believed in the two-state solution. But the two-state solution is a train that left the station a long time ago. 700,000 settlers in the West Bank prevented any kind of Palestinian state, and there will never be a Palestinian state as long as the settlers are there, and the settlers will never be evacuated. So if you talk with me about a very broad scheme, not ending this war now in Gaza, but really for a long range, a real vision, the vision is only the choice between an apartheid state between the river and the sea or a democracy between the river and the sea. There is no third way anymore, unfortunately. And we have to choose, and the world has to choose. Is the world ready to accept a second apartheid state, or is the world ready to act for having an equal democracy for Palestinians and Israelis living between the river and the sea?
Well, on that vision, which of course can never be foreclosed, it's hard to predict the future. Let me go through a number of categories here that you have written about and that people are not aware of. You've focused on the collapse of the left in Israel after October 7th, where the left fell in with the right in terms of a no-holds-barred attack on the Palestinians in Gaza, regardless of civilian or military targets. In the United States, we saw on December 13th, 2023, in the New York Times, an article signed by 16 Israeli human rights groups, including B'Tselem, the civil liberties group, as well as the Refuseniks and Breaking the Silence and Rabbis for Human Rights, asking Joe Biden to confront what they called, quote, the human catastrophe in Gaza. So there is some left remaining opposing what Netanyahu's doing. How do you characterize the left here?
First of all the respect to those devoted groups who still exist and are still struggling. But the problem is in broader terms, because the peace camp was once perceived as much bigger and much more solid. So many of my friends lost it on the 7th of October. So many so-called leftist Zionists lost any interest in what's going on in Gaza, lost any kind of empathy toward the victims of Gaza, and there are so many, and above all, felt what every Israeli almost feels today, that after the 7th of October, Israel had the right to do whatever it wants without any limits, not morally and not legally. And that's a very dangerous path, and we see the outcome. Gaza turned into hell, and no 7th of October can justify it. No 7th of October. With all my shock on the 7th of October, it should have been, reacted, and those who took responsibility should have been punished, everything true. But you don't kill 1,000 infants less than 1 year old, and you don't kill 17,000 children, and you don't destroy the Gaza Strip totally, and you don't kill women and children without any borders. This is out of the question. And unfortunately, in Israel, you cannot get any kind of empathy, any kind of interest to know what's happening in Gaza. More than this, in Israel today, to have some kind of empathy with or solidarity with the Palestinians is betray. You can't express it. And this is so dangerous.
We're talking with Gideon Levy, who has just come out with the book, The Killing of Gaza, Reports on a Catastrophe. It's a collection of his incisive columns and articles starting from 2014, when there was an outburst of violence on the Palestinians from the Israeli side, and continues most heavily on the situation after October 7th. Now, inside Israel, you say that the Israelis are not being exposed to media reports about what's going on just a few miles away in devastated Gaza day after day, other than for your newspaper, Haaretz, and maybe one or two television stations. But isn't it true that apart from the October 7th casualties on the Israeli side, that Netanyahu is pretty much despised by a majority of the Israeli people, because he tried to undermine the judiciary's independence that led to hundreds of thousands of demonstrators again and again in Tel Aviv and other cities in Israel before October 7th. He's under indictment and is about to be prosecuted, perhaps in a trial, by Israeli prosecutors for corruption. And he has generally not proceeded in a way that has made him very popular in Israel. How does he get away with all this?
It is all true, Ralph, but you should remember that there is a very, very solid and devoted camp which supports Netanyahu blindly and automatically, no matter what he does. And even in the polls now, Netanyahu is the most popular politician in Israel. He's not able right now to create a government according to the polls, but he's still the most popular politician in Israel. Yes, there is a lot of resistance to Netanyahu, but there is no resistance to the war. Yes, there is a lot of resistance to the way that he's handling the hostages, the release of the hostages, but there is no resistance to the crimes of war in Gaza. And this is so disturbing. Now, Netanyahu, like many populist politicians, knows his way. He knows the popular sentiment and he plays on it. The media is collaborating by not showing Gaza at all. And Netanyahu knows to play very rightly on all kinds of patriotic sentiments and also victimization. Victimization is also something which he knows to play on. The victimization of Israel, the victimization of certain classes in Israel, and his own victimization. It all gets into one show in which he misleads everyone, and is still the most popular politician in Israel.
Well, let's take it down to the Old Testament, which had a very frequently quoted recommendation in the words, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's often misinterpreted by people who don't know much about the Old Testament as an exhortation of revenge, when biblical scholars have told me it's just the opposite. It was designed to restrain escalating cycles of revenge back and forth, which is why it was restricted to eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Well, it's now perhaps 400 eyes for eye and 400 tooth for tooth in terms of Palestinian casualties, which are vastly undercounted, and we'll get to that in a moment. Does that affect any kind of dialogue in a state that is prominently associated with the Judaic religion?
Not at all, because with the Jewish religion, you can play as much as you want and manipulate as much as you want. You will find everything there. You have just to choose. And therefore, the religious Jews are the worst of all, if I take a generalization, which is unfair. Not all of them, obviously. But they play with the religion in order they recruit the religion to their own political and territorial claims and interests. And they are using the Torah in order to claim that the Jews are the chosen people, the Jews are the only people who has the right over this piece of land, and the Jews have the right to do whatever they want because they are the lighthouse of the world. That's the way of the thinking. And therefore, we better put aside religion and we better put aside the Torah or everything which is around it, because this will not lead us to anywhere. We have to stick to global universal values. Occupation is illegal, apartheid is immoral, and war is always cruel.
Well, you've written in your book, which I urge people to read, it's so insightful, so moral, so factual, called The Killing of Gaza Report on a Catastrophe by Gideon Levy. You wrote at the end of your book that Israel has lost its conscience. I've always thought, and I'm not the only one in progressive circles, that the most devastating exposés of what the Netanyahu genocidal destruction of Gaza will come from Israel itself and not just from Haaretz. And in recent weeks, you have the release by an Israeli historian, Lee Mordechai, of a 200-page report with video accompaniments about the war crimes, as he calls it, of Netanyahu's regime in Gaza. You have a new documentary film coming out called The Bibi Files on the corruption claims against Netanyahu, among other material. And you have the reports by Beth Salem. So is it correct to assume that this is going to be expanded, even though they have suppressed the documentary from being seen in Israel called the Bibi Files? Are we accurate in our prediction that with groups like Breaking the Silence and the Refuseniks, who were really thrown on the defensive after October 7th and told to shut up, that there's going to be an emergence of accurate reporting and a more democratic process of discussion, or is that too much to hope for?
Unfortunately, Ralph, it's much too much to hope so, because you see the outcome. Everything you mention is obviously true, but Israel chose to deny. Israel chose to lie itself. Israel chose not to know, not to see, and to feel very content about itself, believing that the IDF is the most moral army in the world, even now, even after this horrible year in which the IDF slaughtered children and babies and everything. You mentioned before one eye for 400 eyes. It's not only one eye for 400 eyes. It's in many cases one eye for 400 eyes of children or women or old people or handicapped people. So it's even much worse than you describe it. And as I said, on the 7th of October, something happened to Israeli society. Not that it wasn't before, but after the 7th of October, an iron curtain fall between Israel and any kind of human sentiments toward Gaza, toward the people of Gaza, toward the victims of Gaza. We don't want to hear, we don't want to know, we are not bothered, and we have the right to do whatever we want.
Well, in your book, you have really graphic descriptions here of the savagery of the Israeli military in Gaza. It seems like they have no rules of engagement, no restraint from their commanders or from the generals, and they're destroying everything. Schools, refugee camps, ambulances, hospitals, clinics. They're uprooting the small agricultural areas, bulldozing cemeteries, destroying universities, libraries, anything of culture, apartment buildings, homes, bakeries. It's like it's an army that's gone berserk. And I just want to read on page 282, just a snapshot of what you have observed. Quote, Mara, his niece, was the only one who was not asleep when the missile tore into her family's home. She saw it all. It's like something out of a horror movie. She told her uncle in the Egyptian capital. The missile killed his other niece, Iman. In her arms was her 7-month-old daughter, who was also killed. Her 4-year-old son was thrown into the neighbor's apartment and killed. She also saw how the missile tore apart the bodies of her 4-year-old twins, Isser and Asser, and severed the arm of her son Nasser, 7. Marwa's mother and brother were also killed before her eyes by the missile. She lost her husband at the beginning of the war. He was killed during the funeral of his niece. That is what the International Court of Justice demanded an end to on Friday. This is Israel's last chance. You wrote this column in May. Let's talk about the World Court and the International Criminal Court, which has issued an arrest warrant for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant, as well as 2 Hamas leaders who will never be prosecuted because they've been assassinated already and dispatched by the Israeli missile capabilities. What's the story in Israel here? The lawyers in Israel, the judges in Israel, all we hear is a recurrent blast from Netanyahu accusing the 2 courts of anti-Semitism. What's the story?
It's not only Netanyahu blamed quotes as anti-Semites, it's the general mood, it's the mindset of Israelis. Anyone who criticizes Israel, especially in the last year, is by definition an anti-Semite. You can't raise your voice against this war. You can't even pay solidarity with the Palestinians or with the people of Gaza or with the children of Gaza without being accused in anti-Semitism. And the whole world is against us, and this put the blame on the shoulders of the world and leave us, the Israelis, clean, moral, just. We have no responsibility for anything. We are just defending ourselves. Now, the term defending ourselves is misused by Israel into really a horrific dimension. Everything is self-defense. All the things you just described, all the destruction. Why is the destruction of a hospital self-defense? Why is the killing of thousands of children? What does it have to do with self-defense? But that's the way it is being sold to the Israelis. That's the way they choose to believe in. And that's the way that they are convinced that it reflects reality in this war. The Israelis' hearts are concentrated only in one thing now, the fate of the hostages, which is a very, very human issue and heavy issue, but it does not mean that you can ignore everything else. By all means, not.
Well, we're going to get to the hostages in a minute, but I just want to dwell a little bit on this constant charge in the U.S. of any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. And if it comes from Jewish Voice for Peace, or if not now, which are Jewish American activists, they're called self-hating Jews. The anti-Semitism charge on university campuses has been truly devastating. It's led to suspension of students, not giving them their diplomas on graduation. And these are not violent statements at all. They're just criticisms writers and Haaretz have made. Events are canceled. People are not getting positions that they've applied to. Law firms are turning down law school graduates, for example, from Harvard and other law schools who have dared to speak out against the Israeli genocide. And by the way, the violation of 6 federal laws that condition the shipment of weapons to foreign countries on such things as observing human rights, the Leahy Amendment, and observing the right of entry of U.S.-funded humanitarian aid into areas around the world. And Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken are simply not enforcing those laws, nor is the Congress. How would you advise Americans who are being shut up with that charge by AIPAC and other Israeli government can do no wrong lobbies in the U.S.? How would you advise them to respond?
Starts to become a major problem of freedom of speech, not only in the United States, also obviously in Europe, and it starts to create really an unacceptable situation. The success, the efficiency of the Israeli propaganda, together with the Israeli lobby in the United States, by labeling any criticism as anti-Semitism, is by far too successful. And it succeeded to paralyze the United States and to paralyze Europe and to paralyze part of your conscience. What is it? How can you accept it? I mean, it must create some kind of resistance. It cannot be accepted like this. There is anti-Semitism in the United States and in Europe, and it should be fought, no doubt about it. But most of those who raise their voice now against the war in Gaza are people of conscience, not anti-Semites, but people of conscience. No person of conscience can remain silent when you see the images from Gaza. Who can remain silent when you see those images? What does this have to do with anti-Semitism? And even if we speak about anti-Semitism, I must tell you that yes, the war in Gaza increases anti-Semitism all over the world and supplies anti-Semitism with a lot of fuel, because here you see, look what the Jews are doing. So if you really want to fight anti-Semitism, stop the war in Gaza.
You know, you've talked about civilian casualties very eloquently, Gideon, so let's get into that with some granularity. There are still columnists in the United States like Bret Stephens of the New York Times and Charles Lane and Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post, who truly still write that the Israeli government does not target civilians directly in Palestine. Of course, this has been refuted over the years by Abba Eban and other high military officials back in the early 1980s, saying, in effect, the Israeli military has purposely focused on civilians from day one in the late 1940s. Well, you have documented this with your reports on the treatment of defenseless villages in the West Bank, on the slaughter of Gaza civilians, and on the thousands of hostages in Israeli prisons. We hear about the 100 hostages held by Hamas underground, mostly a great deal in the U.S. media, but we don't hear much about the torture and the other mistreatment of thousands of Palestinians, some of them women and children, who were arrested, just arbitrarily kidnapped and sent to Israeli jails, filling the jails to a point where the minister in charge of prisons is saying to the military, stop sending us prisoners. We don't have any space for them. Could you talk a little bit about the targeted impact on villages by the colonizers in the West Bank and your detailed reporting on the prisons.
Let me start with the prisons. Guantanamo was one of the dark points of the United States. I think over 20 years, there were 9 prisoners who died in Guantanamo. In Israeli prisons, at least 48 prisoners were killed or died in the last year, in 1 year. 48 in 1 year. The authorities don't give any details about the way they were killed, part of them by torturing, part of them by preventing them from any medical treatment, and part of them because of the conditions that they are being held. This is not an issue in the world. Everyone is about the hostages, which should be the case. I mean, don't underestimate the hostages' fate. It is horrible. But this does not mean that we should ignore the Palestinian hostages in Israel. And I call them hostages because, as you just mentioned it, they were kidnapped. In many cases, their families have no clue where are they alive, are they dead. Israel does not let the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, to visit them. Israel does not give any information about the prisoners in her hand. Now, with all the respect, Israel is supposed to be a democracy. It's a sovereign state, and it's reacting like a terror organization when it comes to prisoners. This cannot be accepted also by the United States. Now, as for the killing, it's very pleasant to remember Abba Ibn. I was privileged enough still to know him in person. Those were different days, and also in those days, things were not so beautiful as Israel had portrayed it. But many things changed ever since this. And in this war in Gaza, to claim that Israel is not killing deliberately civilians or children or women is just a bad joke. I mean, I don't think that anyone serious can claim it. It's too shameful even to claim it when the figures are so clear. When you see a person on a roof of a building for 1 second, without even knowing what did he do on the roof, and it's a building of 8 floors, and you you bomb the whole building with all the tens of people who are living in this house, only because you have some suspicion that on the roof there was maybe someone who was monitoring the army. What is this if not a mass killing? What is this if not deliberately killing civilians? What do you think, that the houses in Gaza are empty, nobody lives there? And this is happening on a daily basis, what I'm describing here. Every day now, there are dozens of Palestinians being killed while the war is over. There is nobody fighting in Gaza anymore. I mean, this is not a war anymore. This is a daily killing of Palestinians.
In the West Bank?
It's a very similar story, or turns into a similar story, because the soldiers moving from Gaza to the West Bank, and those who are not in Gaza and are jealous at their friends in Gaza, they use now the same methods with a different scale, nothing to compare. I mean, it is still much, much, much in a smaller scale, but you see it deteriorating. The West Bank is not bombed from the air on a daily basis. The West Bank is not being destroyed systematically, but the West Bank is the next stop.
There are people in the United States that are wondering about the Israeli soldiers, and here they are destroying what you once called an utterly defenseless people in Gaza in prior attacks, and they're destroying them from F-16s in the air, destroying them from tanks and artillery, and destroying them from snipers. So the wonder coming from some observers here is, number one, are these snipers who are shooting doctors in the back, they're shooting people who are trying to dig out the remains of their relatives in the rubble, in the head, they're shooting small infants, as documented by x-rays in the head, documented by U.S. doctors back from Gaza, that they put in a long letter to Joe Biden, which he never even acknowledged receipt, over 60 doctors and health workers a few months ago. Are they chosen for their mercilessness, or what some would call their sadism? And is there moral trauma and mental health affecting some of these soldiers and are being treated for mental health problems in Israeli hospitals? Could you give us an idea of this totally unopposed devastation of a civilian population by these soldiers.
No, in many ways, it's much worse than you described it, because this is the Israeli mindset now. It's not all kind of sadists who were brought from God knows where, or all kind of crazy people. That's the mindset in Israel. A process of dehumanizing the Palestinians over the years and demonizing them, obviously, got to its peak after the 7th of October. We saw everything until the 7th of October, but after the 7th of October, everything came out from the closet, everything, no restraints. And when there are no restraints, young people, totally brainwashed, believing that they are serving their country, the media is supporting them, the Israelis are saluting to them, everyone is proud of them. The pilots are doing part of their work, and the pilots are our big heroes, were and are still the big heroes, and all together turns into a bloodbath. It's not certain soldiers or certain kind of character. It's everybody who serves in the army is now taking part in this bloodbath, and without any doubts, and without any question marks, and without no regret.
Well, it seems from a distance, Gideon, that the Israeli regime has greatly inflated the military power of Hamas and Hezbollah, for that matter. Do you agree that they have greatly inflated the power of these two groups in order to achieve the political ends of taking over the rest of Palestine and getting unlimited weapons from the U.S. and backing from Congress?
Only for this, they really believe that Gaza should be punished. They really believe that they are solving now so-called the Palestinian problem once and for all, as they always dreamt about. And they believe that that's the only way to solve it, by really destroying Gaza and making a place which will be unlivable. And we are very close to it. You think that they do it not in purpose, all this destruction, including any school, any hospital, any mosque, any cultural center, everything. It has a purpose. It's not just for satisfying the sadistic sentiments, not at all. There is a logic in it. We try to erase Gaza. That's or at least the northern part of Gaza, but soon we realize it's not only the northern part of Gaza. And for the north, in Lebanon, they did much less, thanks God. I mean, the destruction, the killings are in a much different scale, because Lebanon is still a state by its own, and there are limits on how much Israel can destroy it again and again. But in Gaza, it's very clear that the idea is to try to push the people of Gaza outside Gaza. And if the Egyptians block them, so let's kill as many as we can, destroy as many as we can, and then we'll see what the world will do with those who will be left there, who will be in any case so traumatized, so bleeding, so injured mentally and physically, that I don't see how they will ever be able to rehabilitate their lives.
Well, as the U.S. doctors reported in a letter to Biden, as I mentioned, when they were over there earlier this year, they couldn't meet anybody in Gaza who wasn't at least sick or injured, if not dying. So the damage to children and infants is going to be permanent for the rest of their lives, as you implied. Let's ask some question about the U.S. here. Joe Biden doesn't seem to know how to say no to Netanyahu, even though privately he said Netanyahu has lied to him. So we tested Joe Biden. Some people have asked him, both people who know him personally as well as open requests, would he demand that Netanyahu allow U.S. journalists to independently report, along with Israeli and other foreign journalists in Gaza? And would he encourage an airlift of horribly burned infants and amputated children to be airlifted to ready-enabled U.S. hospitals? He's let 10 of these children be sent to the U.S. and be treated at Shriners hospitals, and he won't even do that. How is he going to possibly be remembered in history?
You asked, how will Biden be remembered? And I think that Biden maybe had some good intentions, but he will be remembered as someone, and Blinken together with him, as someone whose hands are stained by the blood of Gaza. There's no other way to describe it. There is a full responsibility of the United States to what happened in Gaza. And those demands or requests from Israel to let humanitarian aid into Gaza were only either lip services or ways to polish their guilt feelings. Anyone who supplies Israel in such unlimited and unconditioned way so many weapons and ammunitions is part of this war. When you supply Israel with all those horrible bombs, you mean that Israel will use, and you know how Israel is going to use them. And by this, you are part of the bombarding of Gaza. And that's the way that Biden will be remembered. There's no way to break out of it, because how else can you present him? As someone who begged Israel to send more humanitarian aid to Gaza? Gaza didn't need humanitarian aid. Gaza needed stopping the bombardment and stopping the war. This should be the claim, the demand. But Israel learned, and Netanyahu especially, they learned to ignore Biden because they knew that he will never take measures against Israel, because basically he is the deep involved Zionist all his life. And therefore, demands, advices, threats. It didn't work on Israel. Why would it? It was very easy to ignore all those and to continue. Biden almost threatened Israel not to penetrate into Rafah. So Israel penetrated into Rafah. And what did Biden do? Send more ammunition and more guns and more bombs and more tanks or whatever. That's the way that Biden is perceived in Israel, as someone that can be easily ignored.
And the Washington Post has reported that Blinken and Biden are suppressing reports inside AID, the Agency for International Development, inside the State Department, of all kinds of violations of those federal statutes by the Israeli government, human rights violations, blocking humanitarian aid, suppressing their own civil service, so to speak, and telling Congress not very truthful testimony in the process. Now, Congress is part of the problem here as well. The rubber stamp by a vast majority of Congress of whatever Israel wants is truly extraordinary. But don't you think it would be helpful if some prominent Israeli peace advocates, and they've worked and been in touch over the years with their Palestinian counterparts, were to ask formally the House Armed Services Committee and the House Foreign Relations Committee and their counterparts in the Senate to have a hearing and hear them out for the first time in over 60 years? Would you think that would be useful for that to happen?
So it would be very useful, but Ralph, you know the American Congress and Senate much better than me. And you know that so many interests that are invested there and so many interests are motivating the legislators of the United States, including many economical and others. And as we know, the Jewish lobby is still very, very involved and very efficient. And that's the outcome. I was hoping that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party will get stronger and stronger, and then those things will change. And I still hope this is the case. But by the end of the day, when I saw the last appearance of Netanyahu in the Congress, I felt embarrassed. I really felt embarrassed. To whom did they cheer again, exactly? To someone who is wanted by the International Criminal Court, the ICC. How can a democratic Congress and Senate make so many standing ovations and cheer to someone who is wanted by the international community for crimes of war? This was really embarrassing, even though at this stage they didn't yet publish their warrants, but still, it was clear that we are dealing with a criminal of war. And here, Ralph, I would like to say another sentence. Don't be wrong. The problem is not Netanyahu. Netanyahu will go one day and the problems will remain. because Netanyahu is Israel and Israel is Netanyahu. And when Netanyahu will go, we will get someone else, maybe nicer, maybe less corrupted, maybe will talk with much more moderate language, but those policies will not change.
Well, I'm going to ask you about UNRWA. The Knesset apparently is targeting UNRWA, United Nations Relief Services in Gaza and other areas in the neighboring countries for Palestinian refugees, as a terrorist organization. They've killed well over 300 UNRWA staff. Along, one might add, they've killed over 150 Palestinian journalists targeting them in Gaza since October 7th. What's the point of attacking and killing UN staff and trying to blow up UN relief facilities, health, schools, feeding centers, and even attacking the UN peacekeepers in Lebanon and still remaining a member of the United Nations? Is there any strategy behind that? That seems to be a losing tactic.
No, you see, it works. Nobody speaks about getting Israel out of the UN, not at all. And what's the logic of killing so many medical doctors and medical teams? What's the logic to destroy all the hospitals in Gaza? What's the logic? What does this serve? But when you are in such an aggressive attack with a strategy in which you aim to destroy and kill everything possible, so that's the outcome. It's not targeted mainly on UNRWA, on medical teams, or mainly on journalists. It is aimed, targeted on Gaza, and that's the outcome.
Listeners, this book is called The Killing of Gaza, Reports on a Catastrophe by Gideon Levy, published by Verso. And you should try to get every library you know locally to get a copy of this. You should get copies for your discussion circles, for your book clubs, because it has this panoramic reporting of reality and judging reality by a humane standard and by the standards of international law and even perhaps Israeli law that you don't find in the other books on the Palestinian Gaza situation. Let's go to Steve. I know you and others just can't wait to ask Gideon a question or make a comment.
I'm curious about your own personal status in Israel. You are obviously one of the few voices of dissent. And as you describe, an Israeli community that has been really taken over by what happened on October 7th. How do you handle that? How has that affected your relationships with your friends, your family, your colleagues, the community in general? Because you seem to be standing relatively alone in this.
It's not easy. It's really not easy, Steve. But first of all, I'm used to it for so many years. But it's different this time. I remember back in 2014, in the former Israeli attack over Gaza, my newspaper hired the bodyguards to guard me because it was really dangerous for me to go to the streets. And now I don't feel that I'm facing any kind of danger in the streets. They avoided me from appearing on TV, so I've not been on TV throughout this whole war. TV stations that I used to be regularly all the years before, but I can handle it. But something worse happened because, as you just rightly mentioned, Steve, I was never so lonely because so many of my friends woke up, as they call it, and realized and found the light or found the truth, and they all changed in my family and outside my family, everywhere almost. I just wrote about it, a piece for tomorrow. It is very hard to find a dialogue with someone supportive. And as a journalist, as a columnist, you need some kind of partners who might agree with you, even not for everything, but some support we all need. And this doesn't exist now. I have to mention that my newspaper was very powerful in the support I'm getting. I mean, my freedom is total in my newspaper. This was not harmed for a moment even, nothing. There was not one sentence that I had to change, nothing. And this shouldn't be taken for granted, especially in the atmosphere that is in Israel today. But I don't take it for granted, not at all. It might change tomorrow because, as you all know, the government declared war on Haaretz and took measures against Haaretz, and it might have an effect. But in any case, I can take it. I can bear it. And believe me, the problem is the journalists of Gaza, the children of Gaza, the women of Gaza, the men of Gaza, not Gideon Levy.
David?
Could you talk more about how the Israeli government is using the war to silence you and all the critics?
Oh, that's a whole new chapter, because what is happening now on a daily basis is no less horrifying for the long run than the war in Gaza. Those days in which you Americans used to see us Israelis as the only democracy in the Middle East are gone. And they are disappearing by the time we are talking. By the time we are talking, David, there are more laws, more legislations, and more measures being taken toward innocent civilians. We have a group of demonstrators who sit already now over 1 month in jail without any reason, treated in the worst conditions, and are charged for terror, as you know, for shooting some lightning next to Netanyahu's home with the most innocent and childish intention. Two of them are ex-general in the army and his son, and they are over a month in jail, and they might spend now years. This starts to sound like Soviet Russia, no less than this. No less than this. And for the long run, this will be one of the outcomes of the Netanyahu regime and one of the outcomes of the war. And they are so in such an orgy, the legislators, the right-wingers, the racists, with their successors, that you don't know, the Knesset looks like a circus now. Every day a new law, every day new restrictions. And therefore, I think that Haaretz might be very soon the next target. Practically it is already. And then, you know, it's very easy. They will now, for example, in the next elections, it will be very hard for Arab citizens of Israel to participate in the elections, to be elected for sure not. They are already preparing the legal basis for this, because anyone who supported ever in any vague way what they call terror will not be allowed to be elected. By this, you killed 20% of the voices of Israel. Yeah? And the claim of Israel, the claim of fame of Israel being a democracy was always, look, but we have 20% Arab citizens who get equal rights. And to this, all those things will be unrepairable. It's not like the next government will come and will change it, will fix it in one day. We know how it goes. You see in many countries in Europe, and you know, you might face it with the new elected president as well. Very similar dangers. We are facing quite a similar fate from this point of view. You have president, we have a prime minister, we have a government, you have an administration, a new elected administration, which for them democracy is just something some disturbing, something that bothers. The only difference between the Israel and the United States is that the United States has a very deep tradition of democracy. It has a constitution above all, which Israel lacks. And Israel has a very, very thin tradition of democracy. And I'll tell you the truth, many Israelis think that Israel has too much democracy. If you will make now a referendum, you'll be surprised how many Israelis will be happy with less democracy.
But a majority of Israel, according to the polls, a majority of Israelis want new elections. Are you saying if there are new elections, Netanyahu would win?
We can't tell it, but for sure you cannot exclude it. He will be the biggest party, but this does not mean that he will have enough partners for coalition. He might not be able to create a new government. But you know, this is true for today. He is now in a positive momentum. He is gaining power. Unbelievable. I mean, after the 7th of October, which was a fiasco in which in any other country in the world, the prime minister would have resigned the next morning. The fiasco was so big on the 7th, forget about the war. Only this fiasco would bring the end of a career of any Western politician. And here he is really a magician from this point of view. He is on one hand on trial for corruption, On the other hand, he is wanted by the world for crimes of war, and he's gaining popularity in Israel. It should tell you something about Israel.
Hannah?
I mean, that is all very American. Every bit of that is, you could just replace Israel with America in that statement, and it would be a strong fit. My question is about the rights of Arab Israelis in Israel proper. Let's say what is considered to be the state of Israel and not the other occupied territories. You mentioned the apartheid state as it stands with Arabs in Palestine occupied territories. Are there similar restrictions on the rights of Arab Israelis within the state of Israel?
It's a very good question. Something very dramatic, Hannah, happened there. They are paralyzed. You wouldn't believe. They don't dare to say a word. They hardly dare to breathe. Ever since the war started, there was not one single demonstration in solidarity with Gaza in none of the Arab towns and villages. They are really scared to death. Any sign of empathy with Gaza or solidarity with Gaza, and I must remind your listeners that most of them, or many of them, have families in Gaza, direct families. It's not something vague in the air. They are brothers and sisters and cousins and uncles and nieces. And you just express any kind of solidarity with Gaza, you might be monitored by the secret services, fired from your job, in many cases called to the police for interrogation, and in few cases brought to justice. The universities, which must be the temples of open mind and intellectual thinking, fired professors because they expressed some solidarity with Gaza, Palestinian, Israeli Palestinian professors, also some Jews. So the atmosphere is very tense. And this will also have a price for the long run, because right now they are silenced, but it will explode one day. They have a young generation which is not ready to behave like the former old generations who were scared and paralyzed after 48. This is over. But right now they are paralyzed. There are also legislations, and as I said, the government does not hide it, that they are going to put many restrictions on their way to be elected to the parliament, and this will have a major effect on the political map in Israel, because without the 20% of the Arabs, Netanyahu is for sure the next prime minister.
On that point, what is the Israeli expectation of the Trump regime taking office on January 20th? You think he's going to be even worse than Biden, support annexation, support anything Netanyahu wants to do? What's the expectation there?
Look, he will be very different. There are some good points and bad points. The only good point which I can see is that Netanyahu is scared to death from Donald Trump. He will not ignore Donald Trump, believe me. He could ignore Biden. He ignored Barack Obama, but he will not ignore Donald Trump. The question is what Donald Trump will want him to do. And the feeling here is that Donald Trump wants one thing: stop all the wars. The United States spent $2 billion in this war in Gaza, and Donald Trump wants to put an end to it. It doesn't serve anything for the United States. He will order Netanyahu to put an end to the war in Gaza, and in return, he will let him annexate part of the West Bank. That's my guess. The big question is, will he let Israel attack Iran, or will he go for a new deal with Iran? And that's a very major question. I don't know the answer.
On that point, we're going to have to conclude. We've been speaking with Gideon Levy, columnist, reporter for the newspaper Haaretz. Anything else you'd like to say to our many listeners, Gideon, before we conclude?
No, I'd like to say, first of all, to you, Ralph, what a pleasure and honor it is for me to talk with you again. And you are also a kind of a lighthouse in certain darkness, in certain dark areas. And I'm so grateful for you for having me today. And to your listeners, you really give me hope. Because if Americans are still concerned about the future of this part of the world, those are the best news we can expect. My biggest fear is of ignorance and apathy to this part of the world. And if, as you say, thousands and tens of thousands of people are listening to us now. So I can just say that I salute to you, and the Middle East is urge your involvement. Please raise your voice for justice, because Israel and Palestine will never be able to save themselves by their own. They need you, really need you, and I mean it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We've been speaking with Gideon Levy. We will link to his new book, The Killing of Gaza, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now it's time to hear from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, December 20, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. An 80-year-old woman died 1 month after her sleep number bed suddenly moved without warning and trapped her against a wall for 2 days last year, a new lawsuit alleges. That's according to a report from NBC News. Rosalind Walker was trapped on March 1, 2023, when her sleep number bed, which had its adjustable foundation in a raised position, lowered without warning and trapped her between the bed and the wall of her bedroom in Godfrey, Illinois, her daughter, Angela Moan, says in a complaint. The complaint says the bed suddenly lowered with such force that Walker was stuck and unable to free herself. She remained stuck in that position in the bedroom until March 3, when first responders finally released her. She was taken to a hospital, then transferred to a rehab center. She suffered the entire time until she died on April 3, 2023, the lawsuit alleges. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. And that's our show. I want to thank our guest again, Gideon Levy. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now, but for you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Remember, subscribe to Haaretz newspaper in its English edition. You can compare it with what's being printed in our newspapers here at home quite favorably.